She was a disgraced nurse, starving to death at the top of the world. The last thing she ever expected to find was a body in the snow. But the man wasn't dead. Not yet. And that was only the first secret the blizzard brought to her door. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It was a living thing, a predator made of ice and fury, clawing at the thin wooden walls of her cabin. Margaret Sullivan had heard that sound for 3 days straight. It was the sound of the world ending, or at least her world. Inside the fire was little more than a handful of glowing teeth, mocking her with its weakness. Her stomach had given up complaining days ago. Now it was just a cold, hard knot of emptiness. She was 32 years old, but she felt ancient, worn down to nothing but bone and regret. Back in Chicago, they called her the Angel of Mercy Hospital, a name that felt like a cruel joke now. She was the one doctors turned to, the one whose hands could coax a failing heart back into rhythm. Then came the night Timothy Morrison died. A rich man's son, an easy death to blame on the immigrant's daughter. Negligence, the papers screamed, incompetence. They didn't care that the boy had lied, that he was poisoning himself with back-alley patent medicines. They needed a sacrifice, and she was it. Her career, her reputation, her savings, all of it burned to ash in a courtroom she never had a chance of winning. So she ran. West. As far as the train would go, and then farther. Up into the mountains where the air was too thin for shame to follow. That was autumn. Now it was the dead of winter, and her last handful of cornmeal was a distant memory. The cold was a physical weight, pressing her down. But to freeze was faster than to starve. She had to get more firewood. Wrapping her feet in rags and pulling on a threadbare coat, she braced herself. The moment she opened the door, the blizzard punched her in the face, a wall of swirling white that stole her breath. She fought her way to the woodpile, a pathetic collection of frozen sticks. Her hands, once so steady with a scalpel, now shook so badly she could barely grip the wood. She gathered a few pieces, her body screaming in protest. Then the wind shifted. For just a second, the curtain of snow parted. And that's when she saw it, a dark shape against the white, too big to be a rock, too still to be an animal. Her first thought was that her mind had finally cracked from hunger, a phantom in the storm. But she stumbled closer, drawn by an instinct she thought had been beaten out of her. It was a man, face down in a drift, a magnificent bay stallion standing over him like a silent sentinel. The horse's reins were tangled in a barren shrub, its head hung low in exhaustion. Margaret dropped the firewood. It didn't matter. This mattered. She fell to her knees beside the man, her nurse's hands moving on their own, searching for life. There, a pulse, faint, thready, but it was there. It took every last ounce of her strength to roll him over. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a strong face hidden under a dark beard and a mop of snow-caked hair. A deep gash near his temple had frozen a stream of blood to his cheek. But that wasn't the worst of it. High on his chest, a dark, ugly hole had been punched through his heavy wool coat. A perfect circle, still seeping a sluggish crimson that melted into the snow. A gunshot. Her mind went cold and clinical. Recent. Maybe a few hours. He was dying. The sensible thing to do was to take the horse, rifle through his saddlebags, and leave him. He would die anyway. Trying to save him would only kill her faster. She had no medicine, no tools, no food. But even as the logical part of her brain screamed at her to run, her hands were already working, assessing the damage. She had taken an oath to preserve life. The world had taken everything else from her. It couldn't have this. It couldn't take the healer. The cabin was only 20 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. She couldn't carry him. She could barely stand. Then she looked at the horse. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in her mind. It took an hour of heaving, slipping, and collapsing in the snow. An hour of whispering encouragement to the exhausted stallion and cursing her own weakness. 3 times she gave up, slumping against the man's inert body, ready to let the storm take them both. 3 times the image of that courtroom in Chicago flashed in her mind, the smug look on the doctor's face, the hatred in the Morrison family's eyes. They had called her incompetent. They had called her a killer. She would not let this man die. She would prove them wrong, even if the only witness was God himself. Finally, she got him draped over the saddle. The journey to the cabin was a stumbling nightmare. When they collapsed through the door, a tangled heap on the floor, she almost wept with relief. She managed to unsaddle the horse and point it toward a lean-to before slamming the door shut against the raging storm. Margaret crawled out from under the man's crushing weight and stared at her patient. His lips were tinged with blue. He was fading fast. She built up the fire using precious kindling, her hands shaking. She cut away his blood-soaked shirt with her kitchen knife. The bullet was still inside, lodged deep beneath his collarbone. Infection was a certainty. All she had was a half bottle of whiskey, some old linen from a petticoat, and a sewing needle. It would have to be enough. She cleaned the wound with boiled snow and whiskey. The man groaned, his body arching in pain, but he didn't wake. Good, because what came next was going to be hell. She held her knife in the fire until the tip glowed orange. No anesthetic, no tools, just a kitchen knife and a prayer. She began to probe the wound. Suddenly his eyes flew open. They were wild, unfocused, clouded with agony. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist in a grip of iron. He was impossibly strong. "Please," she gasped, her voice steady despite the fear. "I'm trying to help you. The bullet has to come out." He stared at her, his gaze clearing for just a fraction of a second. Something in her face, some echo of the competent nurse she used to be, must have reached him. His grip loosened. He gave a single jerky nod before his eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp. He had given her permission. Now she had to work fast. Her world shrank to the tip of that glowing knife. Deeper, deeper. There, a faint scrape of steel on lead. She worked the mangled piece of metal free, blood welling up around it. She packed the wound, stitched it shut with the neat, precise stitches that had once been her trademark. By the time she finished, the cabin was dark, the storm still screaming outside. She sat back, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had pulled a man back from the brink with nothing but grit and memory. As he lay sleeping, his breathing evening out, she finally took a closer look at him. His clothes were high quality, his boots were worth more than she'd made in a month, and his saddle, tossed in the corner, was a work of art, tooled leather and silver conchos. This was no simple drifter. This was a man of wealth, a man whose absence would be noticed, a man someone had tried very hard to kill. And as she processed that thought, a new cold fear washed over her. The men who shot him, were they still out there? Were they tracking him through the storm? Had she just invited death into her home? She reached into his coat, searching for identification, for a name. Her fingers closed around a worn leather wallet, but tucked inside a hidden pocket, she found something else, something hard and metallic. She pulled it out, holding it up to the flickering firelight. It was a small, tarnished, six-pointed star. A U.S. Marshal's badge. This man wasn't a rancher. He wasn't a mine owner. He was the law. And that made everything infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The fever hit him like a freight train at dawn. One moment he was sleeping peacefully, the next he was thrashing, his skin burning to the touch. He cried out names in his delirium. "Catherine, Samuel, they have the papers." Margaret spent the next day in a waking nightmare, bathing his forehead with snowmelt, forcing willow bark tea between his cracked lips. He was fighting a war inside himself, and she was his only ally. During a brief moment of clarity, his eyes, gray as a thundercloud, focused on her. "Angel," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "They sent an angel." Margaret shook her head. "No angel, just a woman. You're safe." His brow furrowed. "Harlan's men, the water rights, shot me from the ridge." He slipped back into the fever dream, but he'd given her a name, Harlan, and a motive, water rights. In this part of the country, that was something worth killing for. The second night was the crisis. The wound began to seep, a foul-smelling sign of the infection raging through his body. She knew with a sinking certainty that without real medicine, he would be dead by morning. There was only one chance. his saddlebags. She had been too busy to look through them properly. Now she braved the biting cold, which had lessened now that the storm had passed, and went to the lean-to where the bay stallion was recovering. Tucked deep inside a leather pouch, beneath a spare set of clothes and some dried jerky, she found it. A small, corked bottle of laudanum. A miracle. But that wasn't all she found. There was a wallet, fat with cash. More money than she'd seen in years. Enough to get her through the winter and then some. And there were letters, addressed not to a U.S. Marshal, but to a Mr. Jackson Mitchell, owner of the Double M Ranch. She stared at the letters, then back at the Marshal's badge she'd tucked away. Nothing made sense. Was he a rancher pretending to be a lawman? Or a lawman pretending to be a rancher? Who was this man she had risked everything to save? The laudanum allowed her to clean the wound properly. She fed him the powerful painkiller, mixed with more tea, drop by precious drop, and she prayed. Sometime in the dark hour before dawn, the fever broke. He woke slowly, like a man coming up from a deep dive. The first thing he registered was the pain in his chest. The second was her, slumped in the chair beside him, asleep but still watchful. "You're awake," she said, her voice soft. He tried to speak, managed only a croak. She gave him water. His eyes, clear now, took in the sparse cabin, his own bandaged chest, in her exhausted face. "You're a nurse," he stated. It wasn't a question. Something flickered in her eyes. "I was, a long time ago." "Not so long," he countered, gesturing to his chest. "That's professional work. I'm Jackson Mitchell, and I owe you my life." "Margaret Sullivan," she replied, turning away to tend the fire. "And you owe me nothing." "Anyone else would have left me to die," Jackson said, his voice stronger now. "Anyone else wouldn't have dug a bullet out of me with a kitchen knife in the middle of a blizzard. You saved me when you barely have enough to save yourself." His gaze was unnervingly direct. He saw everything. The patched dress, the hollows in her cheeks, the desperate emptiness of the cabin. "So," he said, his voice dropping, "let's start with this. Why is a rancher from the Double M carrying a U.S. Marshal's badge?" Margaret held the badge in her palm. The metal was cold against her skin. Jackson watched her, his gray eyes giving nothing away. "It belonged to my brother Samuel," he said, his voice flat. "He was the marshal." Was. The single word hung in the air, heavy with loss. Harlan Doyle had him murdered 6 months ago. An ambush. They called it a hunting accident. So the badge wasn't a lie. It was a memory, a promise. "Doyle is a land baron," Jackson continued, his jaw tight. "He's been trying to swallow up the whole valley. My ranch, the Double M, has the senior water rights to the main creek. Without them, the other ranches dry up and blow away. Doyle needs that water. My brother was building a legal case against him, for extortion, illegal diversions, all of it. So Doyle had him eliminated." "And you took his badge," Margaret said softly. "I took up his fight," Jackson corrected her. "I'm not the law, but I'm all the justice my brother's going to get. I was meeting a source, one of Doyle's former men who was ready to talk. That's when they ambushed me, same as they did to Samuel. The story fit. It was clean, compelling, a tale of frontier justice. But something still felt off, a loose thread she couldn't quite grasp. "You were delirious," she said, changing the subject. "You said Harlan's men were chasing you. They'll come looking for you." "Count on it," he said, trying to push himself up and collapsing back with a gasp of pain. "I have to get back. Warn my sister, Catherine. If Doyle thinks I'm dead, he'll make his move on the ranch." "You're in no condition to go anywhere," Margaret stated, her nurse's authority returning. "You'll tear your stitches and bleed out before you go a mile." They had maybe 3 days, 4 at most, before Doyle's men would start searching the outlying shelters. "Then we have 3 days to get you strong enough to ride," she said, surprising herself. "We?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You can't do it alone," she said, her gaze steady. "You'll need help. The Double M is 15 miles of rough country. You'd be putting yourself in danger. Mr. Mitchell, I've been in danger since the moment I found you. At least this way, I'm choosing my fight." He studied her, a long, assessing look. He was a man used to judging character, and his eyes seemed to see right through her. "All right, he said finally. But I pay my debts, Miss Sullivan. When this is over, when this is over, you'll go back to your life, and I'll go back to mine. She cut him off. Her tone left no room for argument. She turned to her pitifully bare shelves. You need food. I'll see what I can manage. My saddlebag, he said gently. There's jerky and hardtack. It's not much, but it's more than you've got. The relief that washed over her was so intense, it was shameful. She retrieved the food, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. The jerky was salty and tough, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. When did you last eat a proper meal? Jackson asked, his voice quiet. She didn't want to answer. She didn't want his pity, but his steady gaze demanded the truth. 6 weeks ago, anger, not pity, flashed in his eyes. Why are you here, hiding out in a place like this? Sometimes, she said, staring into the fire. Nowhere is the only place left to run. From what? She took a deep breath. He had trusted her with his life. Maybe she owed him some of the truth. From disgrace, she said, from the ruins of my life. And she told him. She told him about Mercy Hospital, about the Morrison boy, about the show trial and the lies that had destroyed her. She told him everything. When she finished, the only sound was the crackling fire. My sister Catherine, Jackson said after a long silence. She's a healer too. Not trained like you, but she has the gift. She says healing isn't about who deserves it. It's about answering the call. He met her eyes. 3 nights ago, starving and alone, you answered. That tells me more about who you are than any Chicago jury ever could. The words were like a balm on a wound she thought would never close. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Pretty words won't change what happened, she whispered. No, he said, leaning forward, his intensity magnetic. But they might change what happens next. Margaret, the Double M needs a healer. The whole valley does. There's a town nearby, Martinez, that's been without a doctor for 2 years. I'm not a doctor, she said automatically. I'm a disgraced nurse who saved my life with a kitchen knife and willow bark, he finished for her. Out here, we judge people by what they do, not by what's said about them. I'm offering you a new start, a place to be what you were meant to be. It was a tempting offer. More than tempting, it was a lifeline, a chance to be herself again. But trust was a fragile thing, easily broken. What about Harlan Doyle? She asked. Your troubles aren't over. I'd be walking into a war. Jackson's smile was grim. Maybe, but I'd rather have someone like you by my side in a fight than a dozen hired guns. He caught her hand, his palm calloused and warm. I've built my life on reading people. And you, Margaret Sullivan, are pure steel, the kind that bends but never breaks. Just think about it. That's all I ask. She pulled her hand away, needing space to think. The offer was too good, the timing too perfect. It felt like a fever dream, a dying man's promise that would fade with the morning light. She looked over at him, his face etched with pain and determination. He seemed sincere, but a small, cold voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. What if this was all a lie? What if Jackson Mitchell wasn't a noble rancher, fighting for justice? What if he was something else entirely? And what if she, the disgraced nurse, had just saved a man who was even more dangerous than the ones hunting him? That night, as he slept fitfully, she went through his saddlebags again, more carefully this time. Tucked into the lining, her fingers found a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a wanted poster, and the face staring back at her, under the words, wanted dead or alive, was Jackson Mitchell's. The poster was old and creased, the ink faded, wanted for bank robbery in Missouri. $5,000 reward. The face was younger, clean-shaven, but the eyes were the same, unmistakable. Margaret sank onto the floor, the paper trembling in her hand. Everything was a lie. The noble rancher, the murdered brother, the fight for water rights, all of it a story, expertly crafted to win her sympathy, to secure her help. He wasn't a victim. He was a criminal, a bank robber. And she, the angel of mercy, had just stitched up a wanted man. The men hunting him weren't Doyle's hired guns. They were probably bounty hunters or a posse. She looked from the poster to the man sleeping on her floor. He seemed so vulnerable, so different from the hard-faced outlaw on the paper. But which one was the real Jackson Mitchell? Her mind raced. She could take the horse, ride away, leave him to his fate. It's what she should do. It's what any sane person would do. But where would she go? Back to starving? And what about the money in his wallet? The poster mentioned a $5,000 reward. She could turn him in. That money would solve all her problems. It would be justice, wouldn't it? A new life, bought with his. The thought made her stomach turn. She was a healer, not a Judas. For the next 2 days, she lived in a state of suspended terror. She tended to his wounds, fed him the jerky from his own saddlebags, and listened to him talk about his ranch, his sister, his fight against the villainous Harlan Doyle. Every word felt like a perfectly polished stone in a wall of lies. She played her part, asking questions, feigning sympathy, all while the wanted poster felt like a brand on her soul. She was trapped, trapped by the coming storm of violence, trapped by her own code of ethics, and trapped by a growing, terrifying feeling she refused to name. She was starting to care for the man, even though she knew he was a fraud. She saw glimpses of something genuine beneath the story. The way he spoke of his sister, the raw grief in his voice when he mentioned his brother. Were those lies too? Or was the truth something far more tangled than a simple wanted poster could explain? On the third day, as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of blood and fire, she heard it, the distant whinny of a horse. Not a sound of nature, a sound of men. They were here. "Get down," she hissed, her voice tight with panic. Jackson, who had been slowly regaining his strength, moved to the window. "3 riders," he said, his voice grim. "It's them. It's Doyle's men." Liar, she wanted to scream it at him. "They're not Doyle's men. They're here for you." But she couldn't. Exposing him now would mean her own death. "The root cellar," she said, her mind working with a cold, desperate clarity. "Under the floorboards. Get in, now." "I'm not hiding while you face them," he argued. "You're not facing anyone with a fresh hole in your chest," she snapped back, shoving him toward the trapdoor. "If they find you, we're both dead. If they only find me, I can talk my way out of it." He hesitated, his gray eyes searching hers. For a moment, she thought he could see the truth in her own eyes, the terror and the betrayal, but he was too weak to fight. She helped him down into the cramped, musty space, handed him his revolver, and closed the door over him, kicking a rug over it just as a hard knock echoed through the cabin. She opened the door to 3 of the hardest-looking men she had ever seen. The one in the lead, a man with cold, pale eyes and a drooping mustache, gave her a smile that held no warmth. "Evening, ma'am. Name's Cole Watson. We're looking for a man. Jackson Mitchell. Seen him?" "I don't get many visitors," Margaret said, her heart hammering against her ribs. Watson's eyes swept the cabin, missing nothing. "Funny thing," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "We tracked him to this mountain. Then the tracks vanished in the storm. This is the only shelter for miles." "He must have passed by," she said, her voice shaking just enough to be convincing. "Or died in the storm." Watson's partner, a burly man with the dead eyes of a killer, pointed to the ground. "What about that?" he grunted. Margaret looked down. In her haste, she'd missed it. A single, dark drop of blood on the floorboards, right near the edge of the rug covering the cellar door. Watson's smile vanished. "I think you'd better invite us in, ma'am," he said, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. "We need to have a little chat about who you've been helping." He pushed his way inside, his men following, effectively pinning her in the small space. "Now where is he?" Watson asked, picking up her fireplace poker and weighing it in his hand. "I don't know who you're talking about," she insisted. He moved with startling speed, swinging the poker in a vicious arc that smashed against the wall just inches from her head. She flinched back, a scream catching in her throat. "Don't lie to me," he roared. "We know he came here. Mitchell is a thief and a killer. Hiding him makes you an accomplice. Now, for the last time, where is he?" She had to make a choice. Protect the outlaw under the floor, or save herself. The image of the wanted poster flashed in her mind. The reward. Justice. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely a whisper, an idea forming out of sheer terror. Maybe we can make a deal. Watson paused, intrigued. I'm listening. He is here, she said, the words tasting like poison. He's wounded, but he's here. I'll tell you where he is, but you have to promise to let me go. And I want a share of the reward. Watson's eyes narrowed, then he let out a harsh laugh. A share? Lady, you're in no position to bargain. He's armed, she lied, her mind racing, and he's in a fortified position. He'll kill at least one of you before you get to him, but I can get him to surrender peacefully. That's worth something, isn't it? Watson considered it for a moment, then nodded. All right, sweetheart, you've got a deal. You get us Mitchell, and we'll give you $100 for your trouble. Now, where is he? Margaret took a shaky breath. This was it, the moment of betrayal. She pointed a trembling finger toward the root cellar. He's down there, under the rug. Watson grinned, a predator's smile. Smart girl. He gestured to his men. Briggs, Tanner, get ready. Then he turned back to her. Now you're going to open that door and tell him it's all clear. Tell him we're gone. And if you try anything, one single trick, I'll kill you before he can even clear the ladder. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were going to use her as a shield. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath her feet groaned. A deep voice, amplified by the small space below, echoed through the cabin. Watson, is that you? Everyone froze. Watson's eyes widened in shock. Mitchell, how the hell do you know my name? I know a lot of things, Jackson's voice boomed from the cellar. I know you work for Harlan Doyle, and I know he's not paying you enough to die here tonight. You're the one who's gonna die, Mitchell, Watson snarled, aiming his gun at the floor. Maybe, the voice from below replied calmly, but I've got a stick of dynamite down here with a very short fuse. You open this door, and we all go to hell together. So here's what's going to happen. You and your men are going to drop your guns, back out of this cabin, and ride away. You're bluffing, Tanner, the younger of the three, said nervously. Am I? Jackson's voice was ice. The woman can tell you, I was carrying blasting supplies for my ranch. Ask her. 3 pairs of eyes swiveled to stare at her. Her mind was a blank. Dynamite? He'd never mentioned dynamite. Was this another lie? A desperate gambit? Or was he really sitting on an explosive, ready to blow them all to kingdom come? This was her chance. She could call his bluff, tell them he was lying. They would kill him, and she'd be free. But as she looked at Watson's cruel face, she remembered the way Jackson had looked at her when he'd offered her a new life. She remembered the grief in his voice when he spoke of his brother. Wanted poster or not, he had trusted her. He has it, she said, her voice finding a surprising strength. I saw it when I was patching him up, a whole bundle of it. The lie came so easily it scared her. The bounty hunters exchanged nervous glances. They were killers, but they weren't suicidal. All right, Mitchell, Watson said, slowly placing his gun on the table. You win this round. We're leaving. Drop the gun belts, too, Jackson commanded. The men reluctantly unbuckled their holsters and let them fall to the floor. Now get out. They backed out of the cabin, their eyes full of hatred. Margaret watched them go, her body shaking with adrenaline. As soon as they were gone, she threw the bolt on the door and sagged against it. Are they gone? Jackson called from below. Yes, she whispered. The trap door creaked open, and he slowly climbed out, his face pale and slick with sweat. He wasn't holding dynamite. He was holding his empty revolver and a small, leather-bound book. What? She started to ask, her eyes wide. My brother's journal, he said, holding it up. The last thing he wrote before he died was Watson's name, Doyle's top man. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. You saved my life. Again. You could have sided with them. Why didn't you? I don't know, she said, and it was the honest truth. He believed you about the dynamite, Jackson said, a faint smile touching his lips. You're a more convincing liar than I am. The irony was so thick she could have choked on it. He, the wanted bank robber, was calling her a liar. The wanted poster, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I found it, in your saddlebag, for a bank robbery in Missouri. The smile vanished from his face. He didn't look angry or surprised. He just looked tired. I figured you might, he said quietly. Is it true? She demanded. Yes, he said. And no, that's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now, he said, his gaze locked on hers. Margaret, I know I haven't been honest with you, but you have to believe me. I am not the man on that poster. Not anymore. Harlan Doyle is the real threat. Everything I told you about him, about my brother, about the water rights, is true. He took a step closer. Those men will be back, and they'll bring more with them. We have to get out of here tonight. I need you to trust me. Just a little longer. Trust him? He had admitted to being a bank robber. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run. But then she thought about the journal, about the name Watson, and the look in his eyes right now wasn't the look of a hardened criminal. It was the look of a desperate man telling a painful truth. She was standing at a crossroads. Down one path lay the man on the wanted poster. Down the other, the man who spoke of justice for his murdered brother. Who was Jackson Mitchell? A hero or a villain? And had she just saved the life of a man who was destined to destroy hers? She had to know the truth, the full truth. Tell me, she said, her voice low and steady. Tell me everything, or I'm not going anywhere. Jackson sank into the chair, the effort of the confrontation draining the last of his strength. The bank robbery. It happened, he said, his voice heavy. 10 years ago. I was a different person then. Young, stupid, angry. He told her a story that felt more real than the simple tale of a wronged rancher. A story of a family that had lost everything. Their ranch stolen through legal trickery by a powerful railroad baron. His father had died fighting for it, a broken man. His brother Samuel had chosen the law, believing the system could be fixed from within. But Jackson had chosen a different path. I was going to take back what was stolen from us, he explained. I rode with a gang. We hit a bank that held the railroad's money. It was supposed to be righteous. Justice. But it went wrong, Margaret guessed. It always does, he said with a bitter sigh. People got hurt. Not by me. I never fired a shot. But it didn't matter. I was there. I was part of it. He had run, ended up in Colorado, and spent a decade building a new life under a new name. The Double M Ranch was his penance, his attempt to build something honest out of the ashes of his past. He had bought the land, secured the water rights legally, and for 10 years he had been a model citizen. Samuel had even helped him get a quiet pardon, wiping the slate clean. But the pardon was territorial, Jackson said, his eyes dark with regret. It wasn't federal, and the leader of that gang, a man named Silas Croft, he was just released from federal prison. He's the one who put out that old wanted poster. He thinks I have his share of the money from that robbery, money I never took. Suddenly it all clicked into place. Harlan Doyle, Margaret breathed. He's working with Croft. That's my guess, Jackson nodded. Doyle wants my land. Croft wants money he thinks I have. They're using my past to destroy my future. Doyle hired Watson's crew, men who are more bounty hunters than ranch hands, to hunt me down. If they bring me in on that old federal warrant, my territorial pardon means nothing. My ranch, my water rights, everything would be forfeit. Doyle could pick it up for pennies on the dollar. It was a brilliant, vicious plan. A two-pronged attack, one legal, one lethal. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was a man caught in a vice, his past and present colliding with deadly force. Why didn't you just tell me? She asked, the anger draining out of her, replaced by a weary understanding. Would you have helped me if you knew? He asked, his gaze unflinching. If the first thing you learned about me was that I was a wanted bank robber? She didn't have an answer for that. We have to go, he said, struggling to his feet. Watson will be back. We can use the storm to cover our tracks. He laid it all out. They would travel by night, rest during the day. He knew a series of old line shacks and hidden caves where they could lie low on their way to the Double M. There, with his men and his sister, he would have a fighting chance. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Margaret looked around the small cabin that had been her prison for months. Leaving it meant walking into a war. Staying meant certain death when Watson returned. She made her choice. She was tired of running from the past. his and hers. They left under the cover of a fresh snowfall, Margaret leading her old mare, while Jackson rode his powerful stallion. He was still weak, swaying in the saddle, but he was determined. They rode in silence, the only sound the soft crunch of hooves on snow. The world was a sea of black and white, the trees like silent ghosts watching them pass. They found the first line shack just before dawn, a miserable little hovel, but it was shelter. As Margaret tended to his wound, which had begun to bleed again from the exertion, she realized the dynamic between them had shifted. The lies were gone. All that was left was a brutal, complicated truth. And in that truth, she found a strange kind of freedom. She wasn't just his nurse anymore. She was his partner, his accomplice. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough as she tightened the bandage, "for believing me." "I don't know if I believe you," she replied honestly, meeting his gaze, "but I believe you're trying to be a better man than you were. I know what that's like." For the first time, a real, unguarded smile touched his lips. "We're a fine pair, aren't we?" The outlaw and the disgraced nurse. "We're survivors, Mr. Mitchell," she said. "That's all that matters right now." They spent the day resting. Jackson slept the deep, exhausted sleep of a man running on pure will. Margaret stayed awake, rifle across her lap, watching the trail behind them. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind sounded like approaching riders. The fear was a living thing, a cold presence in the tiny shack. But it was no longer the paralyzing fear of a victim. It was the sharp, focused fear of a fighter. That evening, as they prepared to ride out again, Jackson gave her a revolver from his saddlebags. "You know how to use one of these?" "My father taught me," she said, checking the load with practiced hands. He raised an eyebrow. "More secrets, Miss Sullivan." "We all have them," she said, her voice even. "The difference is, mine didn't end up on a wanted poster." The ride that night was harder. The terrain grew steeper, the trail less clear. Jackson's fever returned, and by the time they reached the next shelter, a shallow cave hidden behind a frozen waterfall, he was delirious again, muttering about Silas Croft, his brother Samuel, and a woman named Catherine. Margaret knew she had to get his fever down. She used the last of the willow bark, but it wasn't enough. He was shivering violently, his skin alternating between burning heat and icy cold. She had to keep him warm. There was only one way. She lay down beside him, wrapping her own body around his, sharing her meager warmth, trying to fight back the infection with nothing but her own life force. He thrashed in her arms, his voice a low moan. "It's my fault. Samuel told me to let it go. Should have listened." Guilt was eating him alive. It was a poison as deadly as any bullet. "Hush," she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "Rest. You have to rest." Sometime during that long, dark night, he grew still. His eyes opened, clear and lucid. He looked at her, lying beside him, her face inches from his. The firelight danced in her eyes, turning them the color of warm whiskey. "Margaret," he breathed her name. It wasn't a plea or a fevered ramble. It was a statement, an acknowledgement. In that moment, they weren't the outlaw and the nurse. They were just a man and a woman, clinging to each other at the edge of the world. He raised a hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "You really are an angel," he whispered. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but it was more intimate than anything she had ever known. It was a kiss of shared desperation, of gratitude, of a fragile hope being born in the darkest of nights. When he pulled away, the world had changed. The line between savior and saved had blurred into nothing. She had stitched his body back together, and now somehow he was starting to heal the broken parts of her soul. But as the first light of dawn crept into the cave, a new and terrible thought struck her. Watson and his men were hunting an outlaw. What if Silas Croft was out there too? What if they weren't just fleeing from bounty hunters, but from a ghost from Jackson's past? A man who would stop at nothing to get his revenge? The war she had walked into had just gotten bigger, and their chances of survival had gotten much, much smaller. The kiss changed everything. It hung in the air between them, a silent confession of a bond forged in desperation and blood. They didn't speak of it. They didn't have to. As they rode out the next night, a new, unspoken understanding flowed between them. They were in this together until the end. Jackson's strength was returning, his fever gone, replaced by a grim resolve. The closer they got to his ranch, the more the land seemed to breathe life back into him. He pointed out landmarks, told her stories of his first years here, of building something from nothing. It was clear he loved this place, this life he had fought so hard to create. He was a good man now, she believed that. But the past has long claws. On the fourth night, they saw it, a campfire glowing like a malevolent orange eye in a distant valley. It was off their path, but it was too close for comfort. "Watson?" she whispered. Jackson stared at the fire for a long time, his face a hard mask. "No," he said, his voice low. "Watson's men are trackers, but they're clumsy. That camp is too clean, too professional. That's a different kind of hunter." "Silas Croft," she breathed. "He's here." It was no longer a question. They could feel his presence, a cold shadow stretching across the mountains. Jackson's past was no longer a distant threat. It was a campfire in the night, actively hunting them. He had to assume Croft and Doyle were working together. It was a pincer movement, with lawless bounty hunters on one side and a ruthless ghost on the other. They were trapped. "We have to change course," Jackson said, his mind working quickly. "The main trail to the Double M will be watched, but there's another way, a dangerous way. Through the old Devil's Jaw Pass. It's steep, treacherous, but they won't expect it." The pass was a nightmare, a narrow ledge clinging to the side of a mountain, with a sheer drop into blackness on one side. The wind howled through the rocks, trying to tear them from the path. One misstep from either horse would mean death for all of them. Margaret had never been so terrified in her life, but she looked at Jackson, his face set like stone, guiding his horse with a steady hand, and she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She trusted him. It was a terrifying, exhilarating realization. Hours later, exhausted and trembling, they made it through. Below them, laid out under the moonlight, was the valley of the Double M. It was beautiful, a sprawling ranch house, barns and corrals, all nestled by a winding creek. It was a kingdom built by one man's will to be better. "We're home," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. But as they drew closer, a sense of wrongness washed over them. There were no lights in the windows, no smoke from the chimney. The entire ranch was dark, silent. "Something's wrong," Jackson spurred his horse, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. They galloped into the main yard, the silence pressing in on them. The place felt abandoned. A woman's figure suddenly appeared on the porch of the main house, a rifle held at her shoulder, aimed directly at them. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice clear and steady. "Jackson?" The voice wavered for a second, a flicker of disbelief. "Catherine!" Jackson slid from his horse, stumbling as he ran toward the porch. The woman, his sister, flew down the steps to meet him. She was younger than him, with the same dark hair and determined chin. When she saw the blood-soaked bandage on his chest, she gasped. "You're hurt." "I'm alive," he said, embracing her. "That's all that matters." Catherine's eyes, the same gray as her brother's, shifted to Margaret. It was a sharp, appraising look. "Who's this?" "The woman who saved my life," Jackson said simply. "Margaret Sullivan, my sister Catherine." Catherine gave a curt nod. "If you saved my brother, then you have my thanks. Now get inside, both of you." The interior of the house was a fortress. Furniture was piled against the windows, and rifles and boxes of ammunition were laid out on every available surface. "What happened?" Jackson demanded. "Harlan Doyle happened," Catherine said, her voice laced with venom. "He rode in 2 days ago, with a circuit judge and a dozen armed men. He had a court order saying you were legally dead." "What?" "He produced a witness who swore he saw you get shot and fall into the canyon," she explained. "The judge declared you dead, your will invalid without a body, and since a woman can't hold senior water rights alone, the rights reverted to the territory. Doyle bought them for a pittance an hour later. He gave us 48 hours to clear out. It was a legal assassination, perfectly executed, diabolically clever." "Where are the men? Where's Sam?" Jackson asked, referring to his foreman. Sam took half the men and rode for the federal courthouse in Denver. It's a long shot, but it's the only one we have. The rest are holed up in the north pasture with the herd. I stayed here. I wasn't going to let him take our home without a fight. She was pure steel, just like her brother. As Catherine helped Jackson to a chair, Margaret's medical instincts took over. He needs rest, and I need to change that dressing. Where are your medical supplies? Catherine led her to a small pantry, well stocked with bandages and salves. You're a nurse? I was, Margaret said. Catherine watched her as she worked on Jackson's wound, her movements quick and efficient. You're more than just a nurse, Catherine observed. Those are a surgeon's stitches. Margaret didn't reply. Her past was her own. Suddenly, a thought struck her, a memory from her trial in Chicago. The legal papers for this ranch, she said, looking up at Jackson. The original deed, the water rights grant. Where are they? In the safe, Jackson said. Doyle's judge already declared them invalid. But are they territorial grants, or did they predate the territory? She pressed. Jackson and Catherine exchanged a look. They were Spanish land grants originally, Catherine said slowly, passed down, registered with the U.S. government when Colorado became a territory. Then Doyle's judge has no jurisdiction, Margaret said, a spark of excitement in her voice. Federal land grants and the water rights attached to them can't be overturned by a local circuit judge. It's federal law. Hope something they hadn't felt in days dawned on their faces, but it was short-lived. A shout from outside shattered the quiet. They're coming back. Doyle and his men, at least 20 of them, were riding into the yard. They had come to evict Catherine by force. It's a trap, Jackson realized, his face paling. The court order was just to get me to show myself. He knew I'd come back if I heard Catherine was in trouble. Get to the back, Catherine commanded, grabbing a rifle. There's a hidden cellar in the pantry. You're in no shape to fight. Like hell, Jackson said, grabbing a rifle of his own and moving to a window. The fight for the double M was about to begin. Margaret grabbed her medical bag. She couldn't shoot like they could, but she could patch up the wounded. As she took her position, she saw another group of riders approaching from the east. It was Silas Croft and his men, coming to close the trap. They were surrounded, outnumbered, a disgraced nurse and 2 wounded ranchers against an army of killers. The odds were impossible, but as she looked at the unbending resolve on Jackson and Catherine's faces, she knew one thing. They weren't going to lose this ranch without watering the ground with their enemy's blood. The first shot cracked the morning air, and all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Doyle's men used a wagon for cover in the main yard, while Croft's men took up positions in the rocks overlooking the creek. The ranch house, built of thick logs, provided good cover, but they were pinned down. Glass shattered as bullets ripped through the windows. They're trying to draw us out, Jackson yelled over the din of the battle. He, Catherine, and Margaret moved from window to window, returning fire, making their small numbers seem larger. Jackson was a crack shot, even wounded, and Catherine fought with a cold, terrifying fury, her rifle bucking against her shoulder as she picked off riders who got too bold. Margaret, her fear replaced by a strange, icy calm, reloaded weapons and spotted targets. The skills her father had taught her, long dormant, came back with a vengeance. An hour into the siege, one of Doyle's men made a run for the barn, carrying a torch. They're going to burn us out, Catherine cried. Before either of them could react, a shot rang out from an unexpected direction, the hills to the north. The man with the torch dropped, his torch sputtering out in the dirt. A new group of riders was charging down from the hills, letting out a war cry. It's Sam! Jackson yelled, a grin splitting his face. He's back! The foreman had returned, and he hadn't just brought the ranch hands. He'd brought a U.S. Marshal and 6 deputies with him. The tide of the battle turned instantly. Pinned between the deputies and the ranch house, Doyle's men lost their nerve. Some threw down their guns and surrendered. Others tried to flee, only to be cut down by the ranch hands who had been hiding with the herd. But the fight wasn't over. Silas Croft and his men were a different breed. They were not hired guns. They were seasoned killers. Seeing the battle lost, Croft didn't retreat. He advanced. He and his 3 remaining men used the chaos to charge the house directly, determined to get to Jackson. It's me he wants, Jackson yelled, moving to the front door. Stay back. We're not leaving you, Catherine shouted. Croft kicked in the door, a wild look in his eyes, two massive revolvers in his hands. Mitchell, he roared. It's time to pay up. Jackson met him in the doorway, his own gun blazing. The two men, ghosts from another life, faced each other in a hail of bullets. Margaret pulled Catherine back as the small entryway became a death trap. One of Croft's men went down, then another. But Croft was a demon, impossibly fast. A bullet grazed Jackson's arm. Another tore through his leg and he collapsed. Croft stood over him, a triumphant snarl on his face. The money, Jackson. Where is it? Go to hell, Silas, Jackson gasped, trying to raise his gun. Croft laughed and aimed his revolver at Jackson's head. In that moment, time seemed to slow down for Margaret. She saw the scene with a preternatural clarity. Jackson, helpless on the floor. Croft, about to execute him. And on the wall above the fireplace, a heavy, decorative frontier rifle that Catherine's father had prized. She moved without thinking. She ripped the antique rifle from its hooks. It was heavy, unwieldy. She didn't have time to aim. She just swung it like a club, with every ounce of strength she had. The heavy iron barrel connected with the back of Silas Croft's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor like a sack of grain, unconscious. Silence descended. The battle was over. The yard was filled with smoke, wounded men, and federal deputies rounding up the survivors. Harlan Doyle was captured trying to flee, his empire of greed and intimidation collapsing in a single morning. As the marshal took her statement, Margaret's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She had saved him, but she had also nearly killed a man. The healer and the fighter were at war inside her. Later, after she had patched up Jackson's new wounds, "You're going to run out of places for me to stitch," she'd told him, her voice trembling. The federal marshal approached them. "Jackson Mitchell," he said, his face stern. "We have an old federal warrant for your arrest." Jackson nodded, his face grim. "I know. We also have a signed confession from Silas Croft," the marshal continued, a slight smile playing on his lips. "He's confessed to the Missouri robbery, and he's testified that you not only didn't take any of the money, but you tried to stop the violence. He also confirmed that this old warrant was resurrected as part of a conspiracy with Harlan Doyle." He tore the wanted poster in half. "As far as the federal government is concerned, your debt is paid. Your pardon is recognized. You're a free man." Relief so profound it was painful washed over Jackson. The ghost that had haunted him for a decade was finally gone. He reached for Margaret's hand, his eyes saying more than words ever could. That evening, as the sun set, they stood on the porch, looking out over the ranch that was truly theirs now. The valley was quiet. The war was over. "You offered me a job once," Margaret said softly. Jackson turned to her, his face serious in the fading light. "The offers still stand," he said. "Medical advisor, head of household, anything you want." "What if," she said, her heart beating a little faster, "what if I don't want to be your employee?" "What do you want to be?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "I want to be your partner," she said, meeting his gaze. "In every sense of the word." He pulled her into his arms, and this time, his kiss was not one of desperation. It was a kiss of promise, of a future built on the ashes of two broken pasts. It was the kiss of two survivors who had found not just safety, but a home in each other. The months that followed were a time of healing for the land and for its people. With Harlan Doyle and Silas Croft imprisoned, a sense of peace settled over the valley. The ranchers, united by the crisis, formed a water cooperative, the very thing Margaret had unknowingly sketched out in her mind, ensuring that everyone had a fair share, that no single man could ever hold the valley hostage again. The Double M Ranch became its center, a place of meetings and new beginnings. Margaret, no longer hiding, came into her own. She established a proper clinic in one of the old bunkhouses, and people came from miles around, trusting the quiet woman with the healing hands and the steady eyes. She was no longer the disgraced nurse from Chicago. She was Margaret Sullivan of the Double M, a name spoken with respect and gratitude. Jackson, free from the shadow of his past, thrived. He was a natural leader, fair and respected. He and Margaret worked side by side, their partnership a source of strength for the entire community. He rebuilt his ranch, and she rebuilt lives. One cool autumn evening, a year after she had found him bleeding in the snow, Jackson led her to the top of a small hill overlooking the ranch. The aspens had turned to gold, and the setting sun bathed the valley in a soft, warm light. "A year ago," he said, taking her hands in his, "I was a dead man. I had a past that was hunting me and a future that didn't exist. And then I found you, or you found me." "We found each other," she corrected him gently. "You saved me, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just from a bullet. You saved me from the ghost I was becoming. You showed me that a person can be more than their worst mistake." He dropped to one knee, pulling a small, simple gold ring from his pocket. "I know I'm not the man you ever dreamed of. I'm scarred, and I've made more mistakes than I can count. But I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." "Margaret Sullivan," he said, his gray eyes shining with unshed tears. "Will you marry me?" The answer was as easy as breathing. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Their wedding was not a grand affair, but the entire valley attended. It was a celebration of survival, of community, and of a love that had been forged in the crucible of violence and fear. Standing beside Jackson, saying her vows under the vast Colorado sky, Margaret finally understood. Her disgrace in Chicago wasn't the end of her story. It was the prologue. It had stripped her down to her very essence, to the healer she was always meant to be. It had sent her into the wilderness, not to die, but to find a life and a love more real and more profound than anything she had ever known before. The wind still howled in the mountains, but to Margaret it no longer sounded like a monster. It sounded like a song of resilience, a wild and beautiful melody that had led her, against all odds, home. If you were moved by Margaret and Jackson's story of redemption and love against all odds, prove it by hitting that subscribe button. You're not just a viewer, you're part of this community, and your support helps us bring more tales of the untamed West to life. What was the biggest twist for you? Was it the wanted poster? Or was it when Margaret faced down Silas Croft with that old rifle? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I can't wait to hear what you think. And remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the middle of the fiercest storms. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next adventure.